my job is to keep you engaged by talking about the importance of censorship in the climate discussion. I'm surprised we haven't heard more about that during the day, because in fact, censorship, or more generally, the withholding of relevant information, is not uncommon in the discussion of climate and energy. And it is quite insidious, as I hope to show you. So let me start with a little context. First, clearly climate and energy are front and center today, a very important and much discussed topic. The upper panel shows that the global temperature has risen about 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1900, although interestingly, it hasn't been a steady rise. The bottom panel shows that since the start of the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone from 280 roughly parts per million up to 420 today. That carbon dioxide, which is due to the burning of fossil fuels largely, exerts a warming influence on the climate. And the scientific questions that need to be answered are: how and why have the global and local climates changed in the recent and distant past? How will climates change in the future under natural and growing human influences? How will those changes impact ecosystems and societies? And in fact, how should societies respond? And in some sense, that is the money question. When you think about it for a minute, you realize that responses have to strike a balance. On the one side, we've got what climate science tells us, the knowns and unknowns about the risks and benefits of a changing climate. On the other side, we've got the world's growing energy demand for reliable and affordable energy, clean, and there are techno-economic realities associated with what we can do about that. And in deciding what to do, we've got to strike a balance associated with values and priorities. What is society's tolerance for risk? What are equities between countries, between generations? And what are the efficacies and costs of whatever it is we decide to do? That last set of topics is not only for scientists. Those are societal topics and should ultimately be decided by the broad society or the elected decision makers. However, it is the job of the scientists to accurately portray what we know and what we don't know. And if we fail to do that, we have usurped decision-making authority from the people or their elected non-expert representatives and taken it upon ourselves. And in fact, that is going on. There is something called the narrative, which puts a thumb on that scale. You can see it described in the New York Times 8 or 9 years ago. And in fact, there was a document that a meeting in La Jolla produced in 2012 about the construction of this narrative. It goes something like the following. Accumulated carbon dioxide has already broken the climate. We're seeing increasing temperatures, increases in extreme weather, sea level is rising faster, there are droughts and floods plaguing humanity. And in fact, those statements are allegedly supported by attribution studies. Namely, some weather event happens, like a storm, somebody runs a model and says that storm was made 32% more likely by human influences. Needless to say, there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of grains of salt that kind of statement has to be taken with. The second element of the narrative is it's going to get a lot worse. Droughts, floods, storms, sea level, inundation, famine, disease, economic impact, every bad thing you can imagine is going to hit us if CO2 goes up. And then as a corollary, we have to drastically reduce global emissions, taking them to zero by something like the middle of this century, 30 or 40 years from now. We need to do that, says the narrative, by ending fossil fuels, deploying renewables. We are being motivated by statements from allegedly authoritative folks like the UN Secretary General, climate crisis, climate emergency, existential threat, etc., etc. This narrative is promulgated by many actors in many forums. If you look at the scientific assessment reports that the UN puts out from the IPCC, you look at the media, the politicians, non-governmental organizations, they're all singing the same song. Censorship serves the narrative. In fact, it is forbidden to discuss various inconvenient truths. For example, weather is not climate. Weather happens every day or even every season. Climate is a multi-decade average or multi-decade statistics of the weather. Nevertheless, every weather event you hear about in the media has got to be associated with climate. In fact, climate varies a lot on its own. And in fact, as you'll see in a moment, there is a lack of trends in many climate phenomena. You're not allowed to talk about the uncertainty and attribution of changes to human influences, or the projections are taken as more or less gospel without any uncertainty at all. As you'll see, the official projections are of minimal impacts or even benefits of a changing climate, and nobody really wants to talk about the challenges of reducing emissions, even though, in fact, those are becoming more and more evident as the world tries to do that. That's got to do with the energy needs of developing countries or the domestic poor and the costs and disruptions of the so-called energy transition. You also see then censoring by the media, by NGOs, by assessment reports, by individual scientists. And that includes self-censoring by deliberate omission of inconvenient truths. There's an organization you can look up on the web, Covering Climate Now, which is several hundred media, including all of the broadcast networks in the US, Bloomberg, NPR, who will not cover anything that diverges from the narrative. There is also censoring or disparaging of individual scientists who dare to diverge from the narrative. And again, you see that being done by academics, the media, and so on. I want to give you a couple of examples of these things. Let me start with an example of self-censorship in the media. And it's got to do with Greenland losing its ice from the ice sheet. And in fact, the media story was that Greenland has been losing ice faster. And if you look, NASA issues a press release in 2020. The Guardian covers it in late 2019. The headline is, Greenland's ice sheet is melting 7 times faster than the 1990s. And they give you this beautiful picture. And it says the rate of ice loss has risen from 33 billion tons a year in the 90s to 254 billion tons a year in the past decade. It turns out that that's true, as shown in this graph, which is the official Danish data. And in fact, from 1990 to the early 2020s, it did go up enormously. But what they don't show you, and I had the temerity to actually publish in the Wall Street Journal, is the full graph. And when you look at it, you say, whoa, wait a second. That isn't necessarily due to rising CO2, because the rate of loss was just about as big in the 1930s, when human influences were only 1/5 of what they are today. And it goes up and down a lot where CO2 was rising steadily. So this is a wonderful example of misrepresentation, or if you want to be polite, self-censorship by the media in order to make a point. In fact, what one finds is that many climate observables show no trend at all. This table shows the observed trend or not in many different kinds of climate observables: temperature, wet and dry, wind, snow and ice, and so on. And what you see is most of them are blank, showing no trend at all. For example, in tropical cyclones, which are hurricanes. I think that surprises many non-experts that we've not seen any trend at all. That statement gets censored. And a great example of that is the retraction of a paper by Almonte et al. A couple years ago. I give there the links for the story. What happened was that this paper was published in January 2022 by the European Physics Journal following the usual peer review. And its bottom line statement is that on the basis of observational data, the climate crisis that, according to many media sources, we are experiencing today is not evident yet. That saying that in public is a cardinal sin. And what it resulted was in non-specific criticism in the popular press, in The Guardian, in AFP, by a number of prominent climate scientists. And I give their names here because I think it's important to see who's doing this. Michael Mann, Steve Sherwood, Friederike Otto, Stefan Ramsdorf, are pretty prominent promulgators of the consensus. As a result of that, the publisher, not a professional society, but the publisher, initiated a review of the paper in October 22 and asked those scientists, so what are the problems? Why do you have an issue with the paper? The only specific criticism that was given was that there was no reference to the most recent IPCC report, which was in fact published after the paper was written and published. And so the journal asked the authors to write an addendum reconciling with that more recent UN report. They wrote that, they submitted it, they reviewed it. I was actually one of the reviewers, and what I wrote at the time was that the original article is a straightforward recitation of credible key data about several types of extreme weather events. I find nothing selective, biased, or misleading in what they present. Where there's hardly anything written that isn't well known to experts, it's useful for non-experts to see the underlying data, which are most often obscure in the IPCC reports. The addendum itself is an on-point discussion of the extent to which the original paper agrees with the IPCC on three types of extremes. The document is up to professional standards, specific, detailed, and with citations. Despite my review and several others, the paper was retracted. It's still available on the web, but with the stigma of having been retracted. Well, what about future trend? And here is a nice example of self-censorship by scientists, because even climate modelers don't believe their own results. Writing in PNAS about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, two prominent modelers said for many key applications that require regional climate model output or for assessing large-scale changes from small-scale processes, we believe that the current generation of models is not fit for purpose. Now, credit to them for writing that in a journal, but you would never see that in the popular media. Even more disturbing is that if you look at the emails that circulate among the Academy members who study the climate, there's this quote: "It's an unfortunate fact of the matter that most policy and decision makers view the science of climate change as done and dusted, and hence the research we fluid earthers are involved in is perceived to be largely irrelevant to the important question of how to tackle the climate emergency. On top of this, if we are let out of our ivory towers to express the fact that our understanding of climate change, especially at the regional scale, is rather poor, how can a country adapt if it doesn't even know the sign of precipitation change with any confidence, as the IPCC figures show? the same policy and decision makers start to feel uncomfortable. They'd rather we didn't say such things in public. They claim it undermines the public faith in the need to take action. Kind of stunning. Let me show you an example of self-censorship by the UN. Temperature-related deaths. If you look in one of the professional journals, The Lancet, of a survey of temperature-related deaths, they studied many countries for 40 years. They found 5 million deaths a year associated with non-optimal temperatures, 9.4% of global deaths. Most of the excess deaths were linked to cold temperatures. Fewer were linked to hot temperatures by a factor of roughly 9-1. During the time studied, the global daily temperature increased by 1/4 degree per decade, paralleled with a large decrease in cold-related deaths and a moderate increase in heat-related deaths. In other words, there were fewer deaths from extreme temperatures because the cold deaths decreased faster than the warm deaths increased. So what does the IPCC say about that? What they said in their summary for policymakers, the only thing they said was in all regions, increases in extreme heat events have resulted in human mortality and morbidity with high confidence. That is a completely factual statement, but it is factually incomplete. It is meant to persuade, not to inform. If one of my students had done something like that, they would have been failed. Yet this is allegedly the best science advice from the best scientists. An example of self-censorship by politicians. Back in November of 23, President Biden said, "You know, I've seen firsthand what the reports made clear, the devastating toll of climate change and its existential threat to all of us. And it's the ultimate threat to humanity, climate change." Unfortunately, the president's own Office of Management and Budget and Council of Economic Advisors a few months earlier had produced this graph, which shows minimal economic impact on the US for a temperature rise of 3 or even 4 degrees. And so I don't know if the president was aware of it, or was self-censoring, or just wanted to make a political point. But there is this disconnect that goes on between what the public is told and what the science is actually saying. Because we're running a bit short on time, I'm going to skip the energy needs of the poor and just want to talk for a minute about a couple of friends and colleagues whose careers have been severely affected because they dared to speak out. There are two wonderful Orwell quotes on the bottom there about the consequences for speaking out. "Intellectual honesty is a crime in any totalitarian country, but even in England, where Orwell was, it is not exactly profitable to speak and write the truth." And they said, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it." And so there's Dick Lindzen, who's already been mentioned, a senior, credentialed, distinguished climate scientist who has effectively been canceled because he's dared to question the science. Judith Curry was hounded from an academic position. She was a dean, I believe, at Georgia Tech, left academia a few years ago. John Christie, University of Alabama, Huntsville, who knows more about the U.S. weather data than anybody I know, again, canceled for simply displaying data. Will Happer at Princeton, senior physicist who knows more about radiation transfer in the atmosphere than anybody, again, effectively canceled. Roger Pilkey Jr., harrowing tales of what he endured at the University of Colorado before leaving to take a position in a think tank within the last couple months, actually. And then Patrick Brown at the Breakthrough Institute, who achieved a fair bit of notoriety by writing publicly that he had to overemphasize climate as a cause of wildfire disasters in order to get it published in Nature. Very serious, credible scientists who have suffered quite a bit. So what? The bad news is we've seen careers destroyed. We've seen erosion of credibility of scientific publications, of scientific societies, of the media, of political statements. We've seen a misallocation of research and societal funds. It is very expensive to reduce emissions. We've seen deindustrialization, economic damage in countries that have tried to reduce emissions too far, too fast. We've seen a slowing of economic development in the developing world. And we have seen young people around the world inappropriately frightened by a hyped climate calamity. The good news, though, is that the narrative is failing. We've seen countries within the last year retreat from absurd goals to reduce emissions and mandates of various technologies. There is popular pushback that is causing political realignment. In Holland, in Germany, in France, in UK, the recent election in the US, and most recently in Canada, people are starting to say, tell me again why we're doing all of this. And there's growing realism about climate and energy. Reliable and affordable are now seen to come before clean. People are realizing that net zero is very expensive and climate finance is crashing, as you can read in the papers almost every day. I want to close with some words from Phil Handler, who was NAS president, the Academy president, starting in 1969. And he had a wonderful editorial in Science magazine in 1980, the year before he stepped down as president. And two quotes. One is, difficulty arises in the scientific community from confusion of the role of scientists qua scientist with that of scientists as citizen. Confusion of the ethical code of the scientist with the obligation of the citizen, blurring the distinction between intrinsically scientific and intrinsically political questions. When scientists fail to recognize these boundaries, their own ideological beliefs, usually unspoken, easily becloud seemingly scientific debate. And then he says, but science will retain its place in public esteem only if we steadfastly admit the magnitude of our uncertainties and then assert the need for further research. And we shall lose that place if we dissemble, or if we argue as if all necessary information and understanding were in hand. Scientists best serve public policy by living within the ethics of science, not those of politics. That was written 45 years ago. It still rings true for me today. And with that, I'm happy to take any comments or questions people might have. Thanks for your attention.